In this video, we would like to discuss the growth of delegated legislation. So, the very origin and growth of delegated legislation was started in England. So, in 1539, under the Statute of Proclamation, the Parliament of England delegated lawmaking power to King Henry VIII, and again in 1834 under the Poor Law Act, the Parliament delegated the powers to make rules to the Poor Law Commission. So, in 1914, Parliament, under the Defence of the Reader Act, delegated unlimited power to the government to meet the exceptional conditions created out of war. And all these delegations were criticized by Lord Chief Justice Hewart in his book New Despotism, where he made the allegation of excessive delegation by the Parliament to the executive, which will act arbitrarily and would use much more discretionary power of lawmaking in comparison to the original lawmaking by the Parliament of England. And this very book, New Despotism, created an atmosphere of disbelief and doubt among the members of parliament. So, accordingly, a committee was appointed by the English Parliament as the Donoghmore Committee, and this committee submitted its reports on parliamentary delegation of legislative power to the executive and submitted its reports in 1932. And after the First and Second World War, another select committee of parliament was appointed as Davis Committee to look into the very scope, nature, and jurisdiction of legislative delegation of lawmaking power to the executive, and that Davis Committee submitted its reports in 1953. So, besides that, now we'll go to discuss regarding delegation of power of lawmaking as under United States of America. And as we know, the American Constitution is supreme rather than the Congress in case of United States of America, and as the very doctrine of separation of power is adopted by the American Constitution, so the Congress is itself a delegate of the people, so it cannot delegate its lawmaking power to executive under the very doctrine or maxim that governs the Congress, and that is Delegatus, non-potest, delegre, and which means that a delegate cannot further delegate its power of lawmaking to the executive, and as the constitution is supreme, so also in the leading cases, the American Federal Supreme Court, like the leading case Yacus versus USA in 1944 and the Panama Refining Company versus Rian in 1935 and the Secher Poultry Corporation versus USA in 1935, the Supreme Court of United States of America decided in favor of delegation by Congress, but expressed that the Congress had to lay down conditions and prescribe sufficiently definite standards to the executive on lawmaking to be held constitutionally valid. So now we'll go to the very position of delegation of legislative powers in India. And in India, exactly as we know, the Constitution of India is supreme. So, the very question of delegation of legislative power is divided into two categories: essential and non essential legislative functions. So, the Parliament of India could only delegate non essential legislative functions to the executive, but not the essential legislative functions which are on the basis of making public policy. So, the Parliament can delegate non essential legislative functions but not the essential legislative functions. It is to frame legislative policy guidelines on exercising rule making to set and formulate definite standards to be followed by the administrative authorities in making laws. So, in relation to that, we'll discuss certain acts and leading cases. So, the Delhi Lodge Act of 1950, and in the leading case, Babu Ram versus State of Punjab in 1979, so also in the leading case, Parshuram versus State of Tamil Nadu 1989, the Supreme Court upheld those requirements in delegation of rule making power to the executive by the legislature. And in connection to that also, we could discuss certain leading cases like Inder Singh versus State of Rajasthan in 1937. The Supreme Court held the Rajasthan Tenant Protection Ordinance of the Governor as constitutionally valid. So also the very section 3 of the act and the extension of the life of the ordinance. So also in the leading case Tulsipur Sugar Company Limited versus Notified Area Committee UP in 1980, the Supreme Court upheld Section 3 of UP Town Areas Act, which was in operation at Sitalpur of Uttar Pradesh. So also in the most important leading case, that is Hamdard Dabba Khana versus Union of India, the Supreme Court upheld the very element of discretionary power delegated to the executive, and that regarding the very date of commencement of the parent or enabling act and its extension to other territories and to its application to other persons, and the very inclusion of certain objects into the parent and enabling act by the executive was upheld, and that decision of the Supreme Court was exactly with reference to conditional legislation, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court in the leading case Hamdard Dabba Khana versus Union of India in 1960. So, delegation of legislative power to the executive in modern days welfare state is a necessity and inevitable, but it has to be laid down certain conditions which prescribe sufficiently definite standards to the executive on lawmaking to be held constitutionally valid. So, the very Parliament of India, even though is not supreme as regarding the Parliament of England, which is supreme, besides that, the Parliament has to prescribe sufficiently definite standards of executive legislation to be held constitutionally valid.